Hi, everyone. This is Colleen Meyer. Welcome to Lafaya Way Live. Let's get started. I want to introduce our guest and our host for tonight. First, I'm going to start out with Lafaya Mitchell. Lafaya is a licensed marriage and family therapist. She's a speaker. She is an author of the Lafaya Way book series, and she's the founder of the PEP, Parents Empowering Parents Workshop Series. And our guest today is Katy Weber. She is an ADHD advocate and holistic health coach, the host of the podcast Women and ADHD, and she is the author of Worth It, A Journey to Food and Body Freedom. And anyone have any questions or comments, put them in the comment section and we'll answer them live. All right, Lafaya, the floor is yours.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us again. I'm so happy to have Katy here today. Katy, where are you joining us from?
I'm on the East Coast in New York State in the Hudson Valley.
New York State. Wow. How's the weather there?
Actually, it's been quite mild this summer. It's been really nice. Nice. Yeah, so...
Okay, so now, Katy, I always like to try to jump right in. So, because, we get our little 30 minutes here and my timekeeper is very, great about keeping the time. I want to ask you more about, to tell us a little bit more about your Women and ADHD podcast.
Yeah, so I was diagnosed in 2020 with ADHD, and I like to call myself a pandemic diagnosis. And really suddenly we were in lockdown and my children were home. My husband was home. I was on call with remote learning all the time. I couldn't really focus on my own business. I really basically had an emotional meltdown. And my therapist has ADHD, and I've been seeing my therapist for years. And she had always been sort of gently suggesting I might have ADHD. And I kind of really was like, okay, I'm not really hyperactive. I don't know why you would suggest I have ADHD. I don't know. I don't get it. And it wasn't until I had a really, major breakdown last year with the pandemic that she said, I think you really need to look into like what ADHD is and what it looks like, especially in women, especially in perimenopausal women, etc. And I was like, well, all right. So I started, looking into it, and then hyperfocus set in, and suddenly I was looking into it obsessively and joining every Facebook group and listening to every podcast and researching it nonstop and was blown away. I mean, it just felt like everything I read, everything I saw, every meme, every TikTok video, every post on Facebook just described my whole life. It was the most overwhelming experience I'd ever had. Really, as somebody who had been misdiagnosed with depression and anxiety for most of my adult life, it just felt like all of the pieces fit together in this, all of these seemingly random issues I had had throughout my life suddenly kind of were fit into this nice, neat package of this ADHD diagnosis. And I was just turning over rocks throughout my, just looking over my entire life, basically from middle school on, and seeing everything through this new light. And it was such an intense experience for me. And I thought, are other women experiencing this who are diagnosed in adulthood? Turns out, yes.
Yeah.
But I really wanted to, have conversations with other women who were going through what I had gone through. And so I thought, what is the ideal platform for calling people up and randomly asking them to have conversations with you? I was like, I'll start a podcast. I'm a podcast junkie. I love listening to conversations in interviews, and it just felt right. And so I was on a Facebook group for ADHD entrepreneurs, because I'm an entrepreneur as a health coach, and I sort of, my heart was racing, and I was like, I'm just going to post it and see what happens. And I posted, I'm thinking of starting this podcast. I'd love to interview some of you and hear about your diagnosis stories. If anyone's interested, reach out to me. And I had 40 women reach out to me that day. And I thought, okay, this is obviously, I've hit a chord, with other women who want to share their stories as well. And that was just sort of, it went from there. And so I've been, I've interviewed 60 women at this point. And then I feel like I'm kind of getting my PhD in ADHD as a result, which has been really interesting because I think so many of us had a really, really difficult, complicated relationship with academia. And so it's been interesting to see, like, how this is how we learn. This is we learn about ourselves, we learn about the world around us through sharing and conversation and that sort of thing. So that's been really interesting.
Yeah. So let me ask, because now that you've been earning that PhD, what would you say is the primary reason why oftentimes females, they're not diagnosed till very late in life?
Until very late in life?
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many reasons. I think ADHD is thought of as a little boy's hyperactive disease or disorder. And so it's not, little girls don't tend to be disruptive. They don't tend to be physically hyperactive. And I think the disorder is one of those things that isn't really diagnosed unless you are disruptive, unless you are struggling outwardly, and so many girls who grow into women struggle internally, and a lot of that hyperactivity manifests mentally. And so, when my therapist was saying to me, like, you might have ADHD, and I thought to myself, I'm not hyperactive. I never made that connection. I thought physically hyperactive, and I was like, I can't be hyperactive. I will spend literally days in a depressive state on the couch. I never thought about the hyperfocus. I never thought about the obsessive thoughts and how hyperactivity really manifests itself internally in so many ways, and then often ends up being, expressing itself with anxiety or OCD or all of the ways in which women experience it.
Now I have to say, I said later in life, and I did not mean later. I mean, later than our boys.
Oh yeah, no, I get it.
Oh my God, you're not that late in life. I know you're young, but no, it's an exciting subject that I've come upon. I basically decided to start my podcast because I just wanted to express and explain to people how to deal with when you have like hypersensitivity, when you have issues that are not so typical. When the way that you feel about things is just so amplified that it seems so very, off to others, right? And so in doing that, I was like, okay, so what areas do I really want to try to grab a hold and address? And I know ADHD was my number one. I had to, because especially with females, the way that it displays itself in females is so very, it makes it such a hidden ADHD, such a hidden disorder for them. Okay, because there's so much going on, like you said, internally, emotionally. Like I said, with the obsessive thoughts lead to the depression, right? And depression looks the exact opposite of hyperactivity, right? And so it's been a fantastic month and a half now of interviewing women and talking to them about women and ADHD. Now, I always tell people I'm like the gumbo girl. So you can start me at, being a touch Aspie, and then, ADHD comes automatically along with that. I don't know if you can find one that doesn't have, there's not a, secondary ADHD diagnosis, good luck.
Right.
But yeah, so it's been such an interesting journey, and to learn how often, the similarities too, how often women are diagnosed so much later and how much more they go through because of that. But now tell me a little bit about like kind of your journey to becoming like the holistic coach. And I know all these things probably work together, but your journey to becoming the holistic coach along with that advocate work, and, tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, again, now I realize that this is typical of ADHD, but I've had like 12 different careers in the last 20 years, right? And so I actually was a journalist for many years. I was a newspaper journalist. And when I had kids, I had, really struggled with going back to work and working on deadline, which all of these things that seemed really exciting to me before I had kids, like working late, working on deadline, the crazy newspaper lifestyle, suddenly I had children and I really, really struggled. And so we, I just wanted to leave the deadline world behind, but didn't really know what else to do with myself. And ended up becoming a Weight Watchers leader. And after my second child, I went to Weight Watchers to lose the baby weight and get my body back, and all of those other ridiculous terms that women are force-fed as moms. And I thought it was the greatest thing that had ever happened to me, and until it wasn't, until I started developing a really severe binge eating disorder. And I was this Weight Watchers leader going to meetings, telling everybody how wonderful Weight Watchers was. And I was really struggling to kind of keep the weight off, and had developed this binge eating disorder. And so eventually I discovered intuitive eating, and left dieting behind, and kind of really just realized how damaging dieting can be to not only to our psyches, but to our eating in general, and how we can develop binge eating disorder. This was all before my ADHD diagnosis. And so I wrote a book as a health coach about my journey, going from being a Weight Watchers leader to being an anti-diet activist, and try to help women to leave dieting behind and really kind of develop a more intuitive, holistic approach to food and health and their bodies. And then when I was diagnosed with ADHD, I was like, so that's why I developed binge eating disorder, like to realizing how ADHD and hyper focus and impulsivity and, inattentiveness when it comes to like developing, realizing our hunger cues and all of these things, there was so much that was, at play with the ADHD and binge eating. And I realized binge eating is actually quite a major issue with a lot of women with ADHD. And so I really kind of pivoted my health coaching business to working. I had always been working with binge eating recovery, but really kind of pivoted to working specifically with women who have ADHD, who can recognize, what it is about diets in general that we find so appealing, why the order, the structure, the tracking, the weighing, all of that reasons where we're like, this is it, I'm going to become a brand new person and my life is going to be great. Why diets are appealing, why they are so damaging, and kind of how can we bring structure into our lives in a way that is healthy and is not going to end up with disordered eating and eventually, binge eating, and how we can sort of work on that with meds, which often, meds and stimulants also play into binge eating as well. So that's also been a fascinating kind of rediscovery as to sort of my own experience with binge eating throughout my life and how it's related to ADHD.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so this to me is huge. Okay, so ladies out there, you heard it straight out of Katy's mouth, that binge eating, it tends to be something that women with ADHD, they suffer with. And
and often in silence and shame, thinking that it's all their fault and they're just terrible dieters. And if they could just get their act together and figure it out, they would be able to lose all the weight, and it's not their fault.
Right. And then getting into that space where I need to create even more. So there's more shame. I need to create even more structure. And then you kind of bind yourself to something that you can't, that you can't meet those expectations. And so it just kind of stockpiles, and it gets worse and worse and worse. Right. So now tell me a little bit about what some of and I know you talked about some of the education pieces and all that, but can we dive a little bit deeper into that, because it's such a huge issue? What are some of the techniques that you give to women to help them kind of battle through some of the obsessive thought tendencies associated with eating disorders?
Well, again, I think a lot of it has to do with the desire for structure. And, structure is something that I think we are in constant need of and seeking, and we're in a sort of a constant state of organization while always feeling disorganized, right?
Yes.
And so a lot of the time, like I said, diets can really be appealing in that way, because they can provide really, really rigid structure in the, immediately it's like, somebody tell me what to do. What food should I eat? What food shouldn't I eat? What do I restrict? And a lot of the time, diets come with a lot of restriction. And this is where it can be really problematic, because structure plus restriction, you end up fighting against your body. You end up fighting against your body's homeostasis, and you can end up, that's why a lot of us end up giving up, because we get overwhelmed really easily with all of that structure. And we end up gaining all the weight back, and usually more, because of the way that dieting and restriction can affect our metabolism. So like I said, there's so much at play there, right? Like,
and let me piggyback a little bit on the psychological side of that.
Yeah.
So you're working against yourself physically, but then you're also, and there's, I mean, like I said, everything just kind of grow just on top of one thing on top of the other, because then you're dealing with deprivation issues. And then when you're dealing with deprivation, then all of the issues that come from, your history of being deprived of acceptance, being deprived of, a proper treatment, and because, you were misdiagnosed or underdiagnosed or, whatever, but all of your history of that kind of comes back in onto you too.
Yeah.
And then you find yourself just unable, like that little kid and that little girl inside of you is no longer able to be denied. So then you get into, well, I'm going to go to the whole opposite end of it, and I'm going to eat way more than, anything it is that I need. Whenever we're out of structure, we're out of control.
Right.
And
exactly.
so interesting. Oh my goodness.
It is. And not only that, but then, I remember when Oprah bought into Weight Watchers, and there was this great article about like what a great business decision it was for Oprah, because programs like Weight Watchers, when they're working, quote unquote, when you're losing weight, it's thanks to Weight Watchers. The company gets all the credit. But
Right.
when it stops working, you take all the blame. And so it's really the perfect business model, because you never think the company stopped, that the product was defective. And so when you think about like, oh, it's all my fault, it's all personal failing, and the system, the structure isn't to blame. That's how we grew up with ADHD, right? It's like school, relationships, careers. It's all about feeling like there was something wrong with me, I'm broken, and everybody else has got the manual and everybody else figured it out, and there's something wrong with me. And so again, those parallels between like taking on that personal blame and feeling like if I could just figure it out, I could get my act together. And it's not that simple. It's the system that is the problem.
Right.
You just have to pull back the curtain and figure out, that you're being sold a bill of goods. And that's really that's ADHD in a nutshell, right?
Man. Okay. So tell me, what is just your number one go-to as far as creating that necessary or that need for structure? Or do you break down the need for structure, kind of bring an awareness to it so that that's so that starts to dissipate? But
Right.
How do you replace the behaviors, the obsessive behaviors, the need for structure, or what are your replacement behaviors?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's really a case by case basis in terms, because everybody, everybody is so different in terms of what they need. Some people need 3 meals a day. Some people can't eat before noon. Again, it also takes, you need to take into consideration what medication you're using. You have to take into consideration your activity levels. So, but again, it's really kind of taking note of what works for you and not feeling like you should or shouldn't be doing something else, and that's where intuitive eating can, sometimes intuitive eating can feel really chaotic to a lot of people, because they're like, if I'm left to my own devices, I'll just eat nonstop all day long, especially if you've been dieting your whole life, right? Like intuitive
Right.
eating can seem really scary. And a lot of the time we're not very good at stopping when we're full, or if you're at a family dinner and you're eating, I will eat everything on the plate in front of me. Like I can't be expected to just, if I'm at a restaurant, I will eat whatever's given to me. That's just the fact of life. Like I won't be able to stop halfway through and be like, oh, I'm full. I'm just not that person. And I'm not going to try to be that person. So then again, it's like, okay, so if that's what I'm working with, how can I work with my brain and my personality to figure out like, maybe there's, if I maybe time window, feeding windows are what works for me. Other times feeding windows don't work for people. So again, it's really difficult to kind of say this is a sweeping structure. But I think at the core of creating structures for you is really feeling like, there is no right answer. I just have to figure out what works for me. And so much of like the self-help and the diet industry is everybody do what what Jim did, you know,
Right.
and that just, it's impossible to, you know, we can't work that way. And it's why we end up feeling so terrible about ourselves.
So let me, because I wanted this for the benefit of just myself and, the viewers out there as well. But now first of all, I love the concept of intuitive eating. And I'd like to have you define that for people, because sometimes they're not quite aware of what that means. But I also, because I'm like super, like, that's like my area. Like, I'm super like love problem solving. So I'm like, okay, so you mentioned, if you get a plate, you're going to eat everything on that plate. So if you know that you're that kind of person, then when you go out to dinner, then you ask for them to bring you, half of the portion, and maybe the other half a portion, bring in in a to-go box, or, and things like that. But it really, can you give a little bit more of a definition for those out there who, maybe they're not as familiar with, the concept of using their intuition to eat.
So intuitive eating is actually, it is sort of a structured philosophy. There is a book behind it. There are 12 principles. I won't get into the whole thing, but it's really just basically trusting your body, trusting yourself to know what is right, and to know that you will crave what you need to crave. You will eat enough vegetables when left to your own devices. And that the problem happens when you start to follow random diets, or what a magazine is telling you, that you should be eating. That really, at the end of the day, you know what's best inside, and you just sort of need to sort of tune in, and you will find balance.
Ooh.
And balance without restriction, because as we were saying before, well, as soon as you start to restrict, then you start to overcompensate. The same idea of like, I can't have cookies in the house. If you say things like, I can't have cookies in the house, the moment cookies come in the house, you're going to eat them all, because that's a mindset of deprivation, which comes from restriction. So intuitive eating is really kind of a practice of trusting yourself that you can allow all foods, and that you will find balance. And that can be really terrifying, especially to somebody who has dieted her whole life. So, what were we talking about in terms of like, but there are ways that you can set yourself up for success, like you did, the example you gave at a restaurant where you can ask for half of the meal. That's a great example of like, I know me, I know what I tend to do. And so this is a way that I can help myself. So there's no deprivation there. You're not saying to yourself, I'm a bad person if I eat the whole plate. Or you're not saying to yourself, like, if I only eat half the plate, then I'm going to be a successful, and this is going to make me a great person if I do these things, right? It's just ways in which you're kind of like, okay, these are ways in which I can help myself to not feel overly full and distended at the end of the day, and then hate myself, ways that you can kind of set yourself up for success without always feeling like the end goal is weight loss. And and again, our preoccupation with weight loss is a whole other issue.
Whole other animal, huh?
Yeah, exactly. Because I think it's, and that gets into our society and feminism and all of these other issues in terms of weight loss. But I think, and just more of a gentler approach to food and nutrition, and really just a gentler approach to how we treat ourselves. And, if I overeat one night, it's not the end of the world. It's fine. I am not going to do that every single night, and to not wake up each morning feeling like today is the day I'm going to get it all figured out, because that's also really not possible.
Okay. So now I'm loving what you're saying, because I'm like, okay, this is truly in alignment. Okay. So this is getting to a place and space where you're now the Lafaya Way step 4ing it now. You're step 4ing it. You're no longer being hard on, no, step 3 and step 4. You threw both of them in there. So now you're no longer being hard on yourself for things. You're focusing more on the things you want more of, which is health and, and trust in self and loving self and all of that, as opposed to deprivation, guilt, feeling bad about self, mistrust of self, and all those things. That what we misunderstand is that if we focus more on those negative things that we don't want, that does not put us in a position where we'll do less. We actually do more because we're putting the energy into the wrong space.
Yes.
Right? And so
Yeah.
you are so I mean, well, sorry. You're onyx. I love hearing about that because and it's so difficult to try to, define, because like you said, it really is based on the individual. Now, it's really exciting to hear about your work, because you know what, it's going to be successful because it's going to teach women how to love themselves. And when they learn to love themselves, then they will grow in the direction that they want to be just by that alone.
Yeah. And the more you listen to yourself and your body, and the more you sort of start to be intuitive when it comes to how you eat, the more intuitive you become in relationships, and the more intuitive you become with like career decisions. And it is amazing how like the more you listen to your body, the louder it gets in so many elements of your life, which is magical.
Yes. Okay. So one of my favorite things is don't feed the beast. Like the things that you don't want, don't feed those. Please feed the things. And I don't really have a name for the things you want. Maybe the angel piece. I don't know. But, feed the things that you want more of. Recognize. And so that's step 4 in it. The 3 R's are recognize the small step improvements, reinforce them highly. What do we tend to do? We tend to reinforce things we don't want, right? We don't mean to, but we're reinforcing those. But we have to. It's about making a shift, a mind shift, where you're recognizing the small step differences, reinforcing them highly, because now you're feeding those and you're making those grow instead of things you don't want grow, right? And making sure that you're always kind of understanding that you're in constant movement in self-love, constant movement in doing the things that are right for you. And all that stuff. Very, beautiful. Very cool. Oh my goodness. Okay, well, that's just exciting. I did not, honestly, expect for our conversation to take this direction.
Me neither. I love it.
Little questions like, how, and for everybody though, how do you feel like, ADHD most impacts women? How do you feel like it kind of shows up in women the most? And those are kind of the more general. But this subject that you work in is so humongous. Yeah. And I don't know, like, sharing that you're kind of, the holistic health coach, man, I don't know. We might have to add something to it, because I feel like, you're almost not doing it justice, because you're doing a little more than a lot of those out there are doing. So I'm excited about the work.
Awesome.
Hi, Lafaya. Just in for your 1 minute. Yeah.
Okay, 1 minute, my timekeeper. Okay, Katy, I think that actually everything that we talked about was absolutely perfect for this day. I am hoping that the hearers out there got a chance to learn something that maybe they hadn't thought about or known before. Now, Katy, if someone out there wants to reach you, then what's the best way to go about getting in contact with you?
Yeah, I would say the best way to reach me is either through Instagram, which my account is Worth It with Katy, Katy. Or you can go to worthitwithkaty.com to find out more about me and my holistic health coaching. Or you can listen to the Women in ADHD podcast, which comes out every Monday. And I've had quite a, it's a topic that eating, especially binge eating, is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. So I've talked about it a lot with various guests on the podcast, and I've shared my own story on the podcast too. So.
Oh my goodness, so awesome. Okay, everybody, make sure that you reach out. Don't be shy. This is now your time to learn how to treat yourself better.
Yes, it's one thing we have such a hard time doing, which is reaching out and asking for help. And I think it's something that there's no shame in. It's the most responsible thing we can do for ourselves.
Yes. And Katy understands. She's not just selling you something and telling you something that she doesn't have experience with. She's had her own experiences, and now she's teaching you from her experiences. Now, that's the best. Okay. All right, you guys, I am so thankful to all of you who joined us. I hope that you learned something absolutely wonderful today. I know that I did. And until next time, make sure that you stay you and that you stay true.